Hello and welcome back to HEMA Fight Breakdowns. Today I'm going to go into a little bit of depth and a little bit of detail on the differences between the defensive left Zwerch and the defensive Duplieren. I think that these are two motions which people do a lot. I think that they are two motions that if you don't break it down very precisely, they can be very similar, or you can even argue that they're exactly the same. But what I want to do is I want to show two different exchanges that are extremely similar, but I want to point out the differences between the two approaches and the reason why breaking them down this way helps better understand how to break down somebody's defense and how to throw proper counterattacks. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to watch what I would normally call left Zwerch. So pretty simple. I come in with an attack. We meet together in the bind. Nothing really happens. I spill a little bit as my opponent brings their hands up in an attempt to parry. I come all the way around my head, rotating, basically going from here all the way around back to the exact same direction. So you could say, for example, that that's 360 degrees of rotation. I go from here. I sort of shortcut the right side of that circle by simply putting my hand back. But once I put my hand back, you could say that's the right part of the rotation, and then here comes the left part of the rotation. Either way, I end up with my sword straight forward, just like I did before, but in a new hand position. So traditional Zwerch, fine. The reason I would call this a traditional Zwerch is specifically because of that rotation. Now, one thing that I will point out that a lot of people do is that they tend to spill far too excessively with the beginning part of their Zwerch. So they come to this bind and they assume that the first thing they have to do is they have to hang on their right side, push someone's blade all the way off to your right side, and then come around to your left. This is just not necessary. And the reason it's not necessary is because the act of pulling your hand up and pulling your tip up naturally disconnects you from that bind. And if someone is pulling back their own sword, ready on that defense, what they're looking to do is they're looking to parry what you're throwing. And by going all the way around your head, what you do is you allow yourself to disengage from that bind and come all the way around a guard that might have just stood right there. So if you want to imagine that my opponent's blade stayed right here, this rotation around would have gotten me underneath of their guard and onto the other side of their guard, which means that they are going from a closed position and a closed bind to an open position and a no bind. That's what I believe that generally you use a left Zwerch to do, or really any Zwerch. You want to rotate 360 degrees. You want to take a big-ish rotation around your opponent's guard and attack from a side that they're not currently defended. Now, I want to contrast that action and all of those features to what happens in this exchange. And it's a very similar setup. My opponent thrusts into me, I engage in a bind, and then I throw what basically looks almost exactly like a left Zwerch. But there is a key difference in this interaction. And that is right after the bind is made and contact is made, the left Zwerch looking attack does not have that initial rotation around the left side, and it does not have that initial spilling to the right. So if you go back to what I was saying before, how people will sometimes overemphasize the right hanging portion, where they'll push the blade to the right and then come around to the left side, there is none of that happening here. There is no push, not even up as there was before, and the right motion that basically keeps you safe and pushes the opponent off into a disadvantageous position is not there anymore. Instead, what happens is I am pushing up and to the left with the inside of my long edge and the inside of my crossguard, and I'm staying on the exact same inside line of the blade and simply throwing that Zwerch along the same line as the sword, as my opponent's sword on the inside. And what the key difference here is that it's outside of the line versus inside of the line. And I would definitely call this a Duplieren, at least in function. not necessarily form. Yes, I'm in what looks almost exactly like a left Zwerch position. It's pretty much indistinguishable. But where I think the key thing to pay attention to is the difference in approach. So if you want to imagine here, I bound with my opponent, I'm going for what I do. What are they going to do to protect themselves? Well, in this case, because of the line that I'm taking, which is just above their sword, the key thing that they need to do to protect themselves is to raise their hands and lower their tip. What this will do is this will get the crossguard in the path of my cut, which is right around here. If you go back to the other example, that same motion would not only have not protected them, but it would have left them more open. If you go back and you watch the previous example, my opponent raised their hands and pulled their arms back in doing the exact thing that I'm saying right now would have protected them. And the reason I bring this up is because what I want to emphasize is that in this case, the left Zwerch and what I'll just call the Duplieren are doing two different things to get around two very different forms of defense. What looks like the exact same move requires two distinct different defenses in order to be safe. And what that means is that if you use both of these in conjunction with each other as a mix-up, your opponent will not know which defense to throw up in order to protect themselves without knowing where exactly you are in the bind and what exact position you're in. Because visually, you're doing the exact same motion, which means it's very hard to read whether or not you should put your hands up in the air and get your cross guard because I'm coming down on the inside line, or put your hands down and rotate your long edge to your right because I'm coming around on the outside line. So the idea here is that there are a couple moves in fencing and in HEMA that if you break down into their most nitty-gritty theoretical conceptual effectiveness, you get two different attacks that look exactly the same. And if you use them effectively and if you pay very close attention to the intent and the starting position of these techniques and the sources, you can find that there's a lot of things that you can do from situations that you didn't know that you could do. And there's a lot of things that you can do that are going to mess with your opponent's head, because if they don't know exactly what you're doing, because you're doing something that looks exactly the same as something else, they're going to have two different responses that they're going to have to be guessing between. And if you know anything about fighting, generally the best feints and the best techniques and the best plays that exist are ones in which they look exactly the same or have the exact same setups as other plays. Take, for example, like just real quick, like a boxing 1-2. Every single time I throw my jab, I have that person thinking I'm going to block the jab. The reason the cross, the 2 of the 1-2 works so well is because now they have no idea whether or not this is just a jab or if this is a 1-2. And because the defenses of those two different things are completely different from each other and have the exact same setup, it becomes extremely difficult to defend yourself from what is, technically speaking, very simple. All right, that's going to be it for today. If you'd like to see your own footage featured on the channel, feel free to send me an email at HEMAFightBreakdowns@gmail.com. Thanks, and hope to see you next time.